Our topic is Pakistan's political economy and its development. Since independence in 1947, the successive governments in Pakistan have proclaimed a desire to remove poverty through rapid GDP, the gross domestic products, growth rates. To the end, the country had earlier adopted import substitution, industrialization, and later on neoliberal free market economic policies. What is the impact of these policies in terms of achieving the goals of reducing poverty and inequality in Pakistan? The question is very important. The proponents of free market policies ignore the poverty issues and emphasize mainly growth rates. Unquestionably, assuming that trickle-down would solve poverty problems. The ruling elites cite high GDP growth rates as indicative of economic development and consequently the well-being of the people. Contemporary liberalization is occurring within the context of a new, growing form of global financial capital, which has slowed down the rate of growth of Western economies by rolling back Keynesian demand management policies and by encouraging speculation activities in the name of financial innovation over enterprise in the rest of the world. This in turn will adversely affect export prospects of Pakistani goods. It is also important to note that at present, capitalism has entered into a period of protracted global depression, and consequently markets in developed countries are not growing to provide a market for Pakistani goods. Growth and crisis at independence in 1947, Pakistan inherited some skills from the colonial administration and army. Although severe financial shortages impacted on the running of the day-to-day government and the rehabilitation of millions of refugees from India. The country was largely an agrarian nation with a very small manufacturing sector. Initially, Pakistan's main concerns related to the difficult situation with its neighbor, India. Moreover, on an organizational level, the Muslim League, the party, which campaigned for a separate Muslim state, was weak. Particularly in West Pakistan, state power rested predominantly in the hands of military and civil servants as the Muslim League was unable to organize at a grassroots level. The party had drawn its leadership largely from civil servants, large landholders, merchants, and tribal chiefs, but witnessed great difficulty after its founder, M.A. Jinnah, died in 1948, and the Prime Minister-elect Khan was assassinated in 1951. Many scholars have endeavored their analysis on the development of Pakistan political economy. The successive governments in Pakistan have proclaimed a desire to remove poverty through rapid GDP, gross domestic products. And in 1947, Pakistan inherited some skills from the colonial administration. These are very important things which Pakistan has used in its political economy. Pakistan and the United States entered into various military agreements which allowed the US to step up bases in Pakistan against the Soviet Union. Pakistan joined US-led military alliances SEATO in 1954 and then CENTO in 1959, bringing the military even closer to the Pentagon. When General Ayub assumed power in 1958, U.S. intervention intensified military and economic affairs. The U.S. needed a strong military in the region to defend their interest in the Middle East and in the North against the Soviet Union. One scholar, Jalal in 1990, argues about that by 1951, the United States policy statement on Pakistan made explicit what had always been implicit, namely that the kingpin of U.S. interests in Pakistan was its army. In the 1950s, South Asia became strategically important for the U.S. when Iran's elected government, led by Mossadegh, nationalized foreign oil companies, came to power. The US and UK opposed Mossadegh's policy of promoting rational national resources and overthrew Iran's democratically elected government in 1953. The US was looking for local allies, and Pakistani civil and military elites were already looking for opportunities to forge close alliances with the US. Various arms assistance deals were signed with Pakistan. In turn, for military aid, Pakistan territories were used to support U.S. interest in the region. On the economic front, the country launched import substitution industrialization policy in the 1950s. Between 1947 to 1958, Pakistan's gross domestic product grew at the average rate of 3.1% annually, ahead of the population growth rate. During this period, foreign capital inflows were insignificant and mainly limited to technical assistance. During the 1960s, the average growth rate in the manufacturing sector was quite high, and General Ayub's government called this a decade of development. However, the broader consequences of the economic policies are important to note. As Ahmed and Amjad observed, the scholars have observed about this period of rapid economic growth achieved mainly as a result of the policies pursued, generated a great deal of economic tension, increasing disparities in regional income between provinces, a concentration of industrial economic power, and the failure of real wages to increase significantly. Development strategy was formulated by a group of Howard University economists and Pakistani civil servants who had received brief training in the US. Officially, it was conceived within the framework of 5-year plans. In fact, in the early years of General Ayub's rule, profits for the domestic and foreign companies rose dramatically, while at the same time wages stagnated and even declined in a real sense, as saturation in domestic demands for consumer goods created an economic downturn. In the 1950s and 1960s, rapid growth rates were dependent on foreign aid and government support to business. Growth was seen as important by neoclassical economists who suggested that high growth would eventually trickle down to the people. So the Howard economists emphasized that the rich would operate savings and ultimately invest, leading towards job creation and overall growth. But it did not happen. Moreover, during the 1960s, the disparities across classes and regions widened. The public spending on the social sector did not witness any substantial rise, resulting in stagnation or little increase in real wages in the organized sector. The government took the initiative to support the expansion of industries, mainly in the export sector, through the Export Bonus Scheme, also known as Export Voucher Scheme. In 1959, which critics suggest was largely responsible for high growth rates in the early 1960s. This was used to both subsidize exports and lessen import controls. The scheme provided additional income to a certain percentage of their export earnings. For example, the percentage varied from year to year and from commodity to commodity. Exports under the bonus scheme acted as import licenses. Economic policies pursued during General Ayub's regime exacerbated the level of the inter-regional disparity between East and West Pakistan. It was said that the resources had been transferred from East Pakistan with all benefits taking place only in West Pakistan. Also in 1950, levels of per capita income were 10% higher in West Pakistan than in East Pakistan, but this disparity had risen to over 30% by 1966, and in 1971, East Pakistan became the separate nation of Bangladesh. West Pakistan was able to successfully export to the market in East Pakistan. However, after the secession of East Pakistan, a large portion of the market was lost, as 50% of the total West Pakistan's export and 20% of its imports were from East Pakistan. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto came to power after the collapse of the military regime in 1971. His emphasis was on rapid industrialization in the public sector, and this laid foundation of heavy industries such as steel mills and nationalization of many private industries to increase state's role in the economy. Mainstream economists have often cited Zulfikar Ali Bhutto regime's 1971-77 for adopting policies which led to low growth and higher inflation. So let us examine the economic performance in the light of the facts. It is crucial to look at Bhutto's government performance in the context of the circumstances and problems that he inherited towards the end of Ayub's regime. Private investment was already falling, and that was decreasing. After coming to power, Bhutto nationalized banks and manufacturing industries, which he saw as crucial industries with national importance, not be left in private hands. The export bonus scheme was also withdrawn. During the first 2 years, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto government witnessed impressive growth. Agricultural output rose largely due to tightened control over nationalized banks, making more credits available to small farmers and medium enterprises. However, the last 3 years coincided with big investments in key industries with long gestation periods, but economic growth slowed down sharply in both agriculture and manufacturing sectors. Z.A. Bhutto's economic policies of nationalization of key industries such as banks and steel mills, insurance companies, etc. was important but lacked any long-term commitments on how these sectors would contribute towards the modernization of Pakistan's economy. Even managers appointed by the government to run these public companies had no enthusiasm, nor capital to modernize and improve productivity and efficiency. As a consequence, these industries soon experienced decline in productivity and profits. Thus, due to mismanagement, lack of funds, and motivation, the crisis in nationalized industries deepened. However, the nationalization program of the Bhutto government did manage to increase public sector employment. In fact, when the Bhutto government was removed in 1976-77, development spending reached 11% of GDP, the highest ever in Pakistan's 60 years history. It will be interesting to look at global economic situation during the Bhutto tenure. In 1973, a fourfold rise in petroleum prices occurred, and import cost of petrol, petroleum products, and fertilizers rose sharply, which led to sharp price rise in domestic markets, followed by a world recession, which depressed the demand for exports. All these international events were beyond control of the government. In 1973-74, prices rose exponentially to 30%. Due to the global recession 1973-74, exports dropped further, while a rise in import prices led to a dramatic rise in import bills. Moreover, the flood in 1974-75 damaged agricultural crops, especially cotton, resulting in a decline of export revenue. In addition, a lack of fiscal and monetary discipline caused a high deficit budget, so that monetary expansion and inflation rates reached new heights. General Ziaul Haq removed Bhutto in a military coup in 1977, and when in 1970 the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, the US provided huge military and economic aid to Pakistan. The US supplied military assistance to the Mujahideen, holy warriors, through Pakistan. General Zia maintained the religious theocracy and extremist ideology to prolong his authoritarian rule. During the 1980s, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states also provided massive finance to the madrasas, the religious seminaries in Pakistan, with full support from the West to advance their strategic interests. Later on, religious schools became the most potent vehicle of dissemination of extremist religious views and also encouraged sectarian division in Pakistan society. In fact, Saudi clerics were acting as incubators of religious extremism and fanaticism worldwide. In fact, Saudi clerics were acting as incubators of religious extremism and fanaticism worldwide. A foreign, mainly US military aid followed in. General Zia ignored the task of building an independent, self-reliant and sustainable economic growth strategy, which would have set the country on the path of modernization and long-term development. The average total GDP growth rates in Pakistan during the Zia regime were 7% annually between 1978 and 1987, largely due to an expansion of the construction sector and demands for consumer goods. In the 1980s, nearly 2.5 million Pakistani workers left to work abroad. Remittances have played a crucial role in the country's economy since 1979, and by the end of 1985, it provided as much as 10% of the GDP. But its role since then has diminished and is currently less than 3% of the total GDP. The main reason for this situation stems from the expansion of domestic demands for consumer goods due to huge increase in remittances, which reached $3 billion in 1983. In addition, the steady FBW of official foreign loans and grants amounting to an annual average of $1.45 billion due to Afghan war. After 1979, the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan, both bilateral and multilateral aid provided substantial funds for Pakistan's economy. Foreign aid inflows were an important source to finance industrial investment during both the General Ayub and Zia period. Also in Zia's period, remittances from the expatriates helped to remove foreign exchange deficits. However, at the same time, talks of the mobilization of domestic resources from investment in modern industries in Pakistan were neglected. This gave the country a false sense of temporary economic security. By the end of the 1980s, the remittances exceeded the value of the country's total exports. Hard currency were largely spent on buying land, building houses, and on consumer durables. Also, heavy industries set up during the Bhutto period were operating and benefiting General Zia. During the Zia's regime 1977-88, the average growth rate of manufacturing industries was around 9% per annum. However, a rapid rise in employment generation did not occur, and the growth in labor productivity fell in the manufacturing sector during the same period. In 1990, The UN IDO report on manufacturing stated an underlying feature of industrialization in Pakistan is the deteriorating performance of the manufacturing sector in generating new employment opportunities. Although the decade of the 1980s has been a period of relatively high growth in manufacturing value added, the growth in manufacturing employment has remained insignificant. This partly represents more an increase in capital industry than labor absorption during the period of accelerated expansion. Average total GDP growth rates in Pakistan during the FCR regime was 7% annually between 1978 and 1987, largely due to an expansion of the construction sector and demands for consumer goods. Remittances have played a crucial role in the country's economy since 1979, and by 1985, it provided as much as 10% of the GDP. But its role since then has diminished and is currently less than 3% of the total GDP. After 1979, the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan, both bilateral and multilateral aid, provided substantial funds for Pakistan's economy. At the same time, talks of mobilization of domestic resources for investment in modern industries in Pakistan were neglected, giving the country a false sense of temporary economic security. By the end of the 1980s, remittances exceeded the value of the country's total exports. General Zia-ul-Haq regime had neither a long-term vision on economy nor a clear economic strategy. In real terms, military spending rose by over 160% under his rule, representing a growth of more than 9% annually. In 1998, Hassan has argued about the situation. The unprecedented growth in defense spending, on the one hand, squeezed development spending, and on the other hand, fueled fiscal deficits. Whatever the merits of increased defense spending, the hard choices between defense and development were never really debated during the General Zia period. Following the death of the general in a plane crash, Benazir Bhutto was elected as Prime Minister in 1988. Soon after coming to power, Ms. Bhutto launched neoliberal reforms, also known as structural adjustment programs, under the supervision of IMF and the World Bank. This meant that the government was unable to use fiscal and monetary policies to stimulate the economy. Their main concern was fiscal deficit and was asked to lower its deficit to 4% of the GDP, to be achieved by increasing indirect taxes and decreasing public spending. For instance, the public spending in the area of development was 9.3% of GDP in 1986, but it declined to less than 3% by 2004. Another area of neoliberal reforms was the reduction in import tariff rates, reduced from 125% in 1992 to 25% in 2004. As a result, a large number of domestic industries were closed down as they were unable to compete with cheap imported goods. This resulted in job losses and a decline in tax revenue for the government. In the name of openness and competition, the economy was opened for foreign businesses without providing any protection to domestic producers, resulting in closure of business units and a rise in unemployment. After Benazir Bhutto, Nawaz Sharif became the Prime Minister of Pakistan. He too carried out IMF's led structural adjustment program, and the role of the state in the provision of social and infrastructural facilities was further reduced under a wave of denationalization and privatization. The public-owned industries were handed over to the private sector. A large-scale privatization was carried out in the 1990 under Nawaz Sharif's government. A disinvestment and deregulation committee was formed to identify industries to be privatized in order to raise revenue. Following the Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif's decision to carry out a nuclear test in 1998, Western governments imposed economic sanctions and the IMF withdrawal aid to Pakistan. As a result, the country faced a serious balance of payment crisis. Depositors started to withdraw their deposits in panic, which led to a huge capital flight and depletion of reserves. Exports were stagnant around $8 billion during the second half of the 1990s, and remittances did not rise as witnessed earlier in the 1980s. In 1997, Pakistan had witnessed a massive foreign debt in excess of 100% of the GDP, and the debt servicing was taking away revenue from developmental and social expenditure projects. Pakistan was in a deep economic crisis where General Musharraf took over a military coup in October 1999. Soon after taking over, General Pervez Musharraf appointed Shaukat Aziz, then a senior manager of Citibank, as a finance minister in 1999. Aziz was promoted to Prime Minister in 2004 and was given the task stabilizing the microeconomic situation. His policies of deflating the economy to control inflation and domestic demands resulted in a dramatic decline in growth rates to just 2% in 1999. The government cut down the developmental and educational expenditure, leading to a further fall in growth rates, 1.9% in 2001. Shaukat Aziz, in order to tackle the balance of payment crisis, sold a number of state-owned enterprises such as banks, telecommunications, and power into private hands. After the 11th September 2001 attack on World Trade Center, and soon after the US invasion of Afghanistan, once again Pakistan became a strategic ally in the war. The economic and military aid again started flowing in, and soon after the IMF provided the approved new aid amounting to $1.5 billion, and previous debts were rescheduled to Pakistan. The rise in foreign aid and the transfer of payment provided a short-term boost to the economy, and the country witnessed a current account surplus. However, the upswing in the economy did not last very long, and in 2005, the economy began to slow down. The price of consumers' goods rose, and the current account deficit increased. This was partially due to poor domestic food, grain production, and also a sharp rise in global food and petroleum prices. In fact, many other developing countries experienced a similar situation, but proved to be better prepared, while the Pakistani government failed to show any viable strategy to resolve the crisis. The trade deficit rose to $15 billion in 2008 from $10 billion in 2007. The foreign exchange reserves plunged to $8.5 billion in 2008 from $13.5 billion in 2007. Since 2005, prices were rising at the rate of 12% annually, and inflation further rose to 20.2% in 2008. In 2007, the poor harvest and higher import prices, especially food, exacerbated an overall price rise. The deteriorating living conditions of the people coincided with the conflict with judiciary and opposition political parties. Moreover, the rich decided to invest their wealth in shares and properties for quick profits. As a result, share prices and urban poverty increased, and the property went up along with multilateral and bilateral aid, which was claimed as a success story. The so-called high growth rates bypassed the majority of the people who saw their living conditions deteriorated due to a rising unemployment, high inflation, and corruption, which led further disenchantment with the military regime. Khan's study regarding the 9 years of Musharraf regime finds that there was an increase of 2 percentage points in the unemployment rate, while real wages of both skilled and unskilled declined by 4 to 9%, despite the share and bond market boom. Macroeconomic stability was achieved by cuts in development spending and wages. The number of people living below the poverty line sharply increased. Despite inflows of massive foreign aid, and the World Bank led anti-poverty reduction program, under Musharraf 1999 to 2008, corruption and nepotism became more widespread, and inequality and unemployment increased further. Pakistan's macroeconomic indicators show that inflation has risen since 2004. For example, the prices rose 7.4% in 2004, which increased to very high levels. For instance, 20.2% in 2008 and declined to 13.9% in 2009. If we summarize statistically, the inflation in percentage, it was in 2004, 7.4, 9.1 in 2005, and in 2006, 7.9, and in 2007, 7.6, and in 2008, 20.2, and in 2009, 13.9. And the birth rate, if we see that per 000, 31.2 in 2004, 30.9 in 2005, 30.6 in 2006, 30.4 in 2007, 30.1 in 2008, and 29.8 in 2009. The total exports in US dollar billions, in 2004 that was 13.34, and in 2005 16.03, and in 2006 16.93, and in 2007 that was 17.84, and in 2008 that was 20.48, and in 2009 that was 17.53. The total imports in US billion dollars, in 2004 17.9, and in 2005 25.33, and in 2006 29.82, and in 2007 32.59, and in 2008 42.14, and in 2009 31.7. The infant mortality death rate with 000 live birth, in 2004 that was 71.1%, in 2005 69.5%, and in 2006 68.2%, and in 2007 66.9%, and in 2008 64.6%, and in 2009 63.6%. And the literacy in adults, that was in 2004 49.4%, and in 2005 69.5%, and in 2006 68.2%, and in 2007 66.9%, and in 2008 64.6%, and in 2009 63.6%. And if we see the literacy rate, that was 59.8% 2009 and 57.7% 2008, and in 2006 it was 54.2%, in 2004 it was 49.4%, and 2005 49.9%. The literacy rate, which has been increased during the Musharraf regime, and the inflation that was also increased, and total exports have the fluctuations. It was increasing in 2008 and in 2009 and 2007. And the mortality deaths, the infant mortality deaths, that was decreased. And the adult literacy, that was also increased. The Pakistan Economic Survey has various government data, specifically about the Ministry of Finance, the Sources Printing Corporation of Pakistan, the Pakistan Economic Survey. Pakistan is the country to have approached the IMF more than 15 times and received numerous bailouts from the World Bank since 1988. However, poverty has risen sharply during this period, and the overall economy has failed on many counts. And since 1988, the IMF has been involved in formulating and advising the economic policy in Pakistan. Pakistan's failure to lay the foundation of long-term, sustainable and self-reliance growth represents the main challenge facing the country. And Mr. Gilani, the Prime Minister, in 2008, has simply continued the neoliberal economic policies, which were adopted since 1988 on the advice of IMF and the World Bank. The constraints appear to be poor human resources and low levels of skills, leading towards a declining competitiveness in the country's traditional export sectors like textiles and leather. Any radical change requires government intervention to enhance competitiveness in export sectors and improve levels of skills to boost productivity. However, given the active role of the IMF, which is against any state intervention, seems to be a long way off. The macroeconomic instability lowered the foreign investors' confidence, and the FDI experienced to $5 billion in 2004 to less than $2 billion in 2007. Prime Minister Gilani sought assistance amounting to $15 billion from IMF in 2008. Since 2008, the deepening crises such as high inflation, depleting foreign exchange, deteriorating balance of payments, and declining value of Pakistani rupees has been witnessed. The government led by Prime Minister Gilani is unable to resolve these economic problems, despite the large amount of aid from IMF, the US, Saudi Arabia, and Gulf states. However, most observers have overlooked the close relationship between the Western countries, international financial institutions, and the ruling elites in Pakistan, and how these relationships have shaped the country's economic policies. The country provides a very clear example of the limitations of the IMF prescriptions and its adverse impact on the common people. Table 2 shows that GDP growth rates, which is now under consideration, we have already furnished that table, and rates were higher in 1960. For example, 6.7% average per year. However, it declined in the 1990s to 4.6% and continued to 4.3% in 2003. The manufacturing sector declined from 9.9% in 1960 to 4.8% in 2003. Services did not do any better. For example, 6.7% in 1960 to 4.5% in 2003. During 2008 and 2009, the GDP growth rates declined to 3.1%. The growth rate was only 2.7% lower than rate of the population growth. Now we're touching the table about the situation which will give us understanding about the growth rates, annual growth rates in various sectors in Pakistan. We are touching the gross domestic product and agriculture and manufacturing and service sector. In 1960, the GDP was 6.7%, and in 1970-79, it was 4.8%, and in 1980-89, 6.4%, and in 1990-99, it was 4.6%, and 2003, 5.6, and 2008 3.1, and 2009 2.7. The average annual growth rates in agriculture in 1960 to 1969 was 5, in 1970-79 5.5, 2.3, and in 1980-89 it was 5.4, and in 1999 4.4, and in 2003 3.7, and in 2004-2007 4.1, and 2008 3.6, and in 2009 it was less, 2.5, equal to 1970-79, which was 2.3. So the agriculture growth rate was also decreasing during the years, and the manufacturing, the productivity was only 9.9 in 1960 into 1969, and 5.5 in 1970 to 79, and 8.2 in 1980 to 89. This was the manufacturing. And in 1990, 1999, 4.8, and 2000, 2003, 4.8, and 2004, 2007, 5.8, and 2008, 3.6, and 2009, 2.8. And in the service sector, the annual growth rate was 6.7 in 1960-69, and 6.2 in 1970-79, and 60.6 in 1980-89, and in 1990-99, 4.6, and 2000, 2003, 4.5, and in 2004, 2007, 6.5, and in 2008, 4.1, and in 2009, 2.9. So it has also been decreasing during this decade from 1960 to 2009. If we see the situation, the growth rate was decreasing in various sectors. Pakistan's financial imbalances are starting now. In 2001, debt and defense amounted to more than 2/3 of the total public spending. For example, $4.2 billion on debt, interest repayment, and $2.5 billion on defense, compared to tax revenues of $6.9 billion. The IMF delivered a rescue package known as Structural Adjustment Programs, included deregulation, a resale of public assets, further rise in indirect taxes, education in import duties, reduction in import duties, and devaluation of Pakistani rupees. As a result, real wages declined, and with fiscal spending cuts, joblessness rose to new heights. The devaluation of the rupees could not boost exports, as IMF was expecting, while the lowering of import duties further deteriorated the balance of payments situation. Devaluation also causes foreign currency debt to swell in domestic currency. All these things has increased the poverty in Pakistan. So the increasing poverty level, we are now touching this topic. Industrialization was seen as a means to eliminate poverty, create employment, and to combat illiteracy and disease. The legacies of the colonial past. Pakistan's economy at the eve of independence inherited an economy where exports of raw materials such as cotton, leather, etc. were prevalent. Unlike India, where British capital investment had created some pockets of industrialization, in Pakistan it was problematic to establish modern industries, and the almost complete absence of any indigenous capitalist class to accomplish it. There were a few small production units that did exist, but their owners were Hindus who migrated to India during the partition. The concentration of land in the hands of a small proportion of the rural population appears to be the main cause for the impoverishment of the rural poor because they do not own the vital assets. This opens up vast possibilities for their exploitation, misery, and abuse. The unequal power that derives from the unequal land ownership is the reason behind the continuing industries in the rural areas. Although in Pakistan, land reforms legislation was passed in 1959, 1972, and in 1977. The impact of these land reforms has been negligible as far as the land concentration is concerned. Under cosmetic land reform provisions, landlordism became more established and entrenched. In rural areas, access to land is considered as a major avenue for social status, and most of the key activities are related directly or indirectly to the agricultural sector. The equal distribution of wealth has not been maintained by the government policies because the government has not created such policies to redistribute the resources of production among the people of the Pakistan. So how the democracy can be seated in such unleveled ground? However, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Green Revolution was launched with full support from the US amidst claims that it would remove rural poverty and injustice. Key variables for the success of the Green Revolution technology package were new seeds, chemical fertilizers, and imagination to increase the total output of agricultural commodities. The rural rich constituted less than 5% of the rural population, were the principal beneficiaries of the Green Revolution, and the new technology made it possible to accelerate agricultural growth substantially through an elite farmer strategy, which concentrated the new inputs on large farms. Now the crucial determinant in yield differences became not the labor input per acre, in which small farms had been at advantage, but the application of the seed water fertilizer package over which the large farmers with their greater financial power had superior access. Thus the technocrats felt the Green Revolution had made it possible to accelerate agricultural growth without having to bring about any real change in the rural power structure. In Pakistan, there was an utter neglect of enhancing productivity of the workers through training and education to the possibility of moving from the production of simple consumer durables towards the production of more sophisticated consumers and high-tech capital goods, which could be sold to the Western markets. As such, successful transformation did happen to countries of East Asia such as Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, etc. Poverty, inequality, and unemployment have increased since 1988 with the adoption of new liberal economic reforms, and the country has also witnessed high inflation and slower GDP growth rate. According to official statistics, the percentage of households living in absolute poverty has risen from 21.4% in 1991 to 30.6% in 2008. Moreover, nearly 60 million people, 30% of the population, now live below the officially defined poverty line, increased in the last 10 years by 15 million. Public spending on education in Pakistan is one of the lowest in South Asia. According to official figures, 70% of female and 41% male are illiterate. The reason for implementing such disastrous policies and seeking continued IMF assistance was due to the fact that the ruling elites are unwilling to carry out essential economic reforms to address the main problems of the economy. Much of the wealth of the country has been transferred by the rich to overseas bank accounts or invested abroad, exacerbated since the policy of deregulation and privatization was adopted in the country, which did away with domestic capital control on the advice of World Bank and IMF. Moreover, having accumulated wealth through the nexus of corruption, many former civil servants and the military officials have set up businesses directly or through their relatives. Rich Pakistanis have accumulated wealth, but they are very few and operate as junior partner to metropolitan capitalism. Much of the wealth of the country have been transferred to overseas bank accounts or invested abroad, which was exacerbated since the policy of deregulation and privatization was adopted in the country, which did away with domestic capital control on the advice of World Bank and IMF. They always rallied heavily on state support and protection to accumulate, thus were unable to develop independently and stand together as a class. The heavy reliance of state support and subsidies and tax concessions has created an endemic system of bribes and nepotism to enrich both bourgeoisies and civil servants. Moreover, having accumulated wealth through the nexus of corruption, many former civil servants and the military officials have set up businesses directly or through their relatives. As we can see and analyze, the Defense Trust and foundations run by the Army has 8 manufacturing units, including sugar, fertilizers, cereals, liquid gas, metals, and a gas field, as well as transportation companies, schools, hospitals, etc. Long-term structural constraints. In Pakistan, agriculture is the largest part of the economy, employing 44.2% of the workforce. A large gap exists between the potential and realized yield for almost all major crops. The country is the world's 4th largest producer of cotton, but output will drop by about 15% in 2010, owing to Pakistan's severe flooding. An estimated 80% of cotton fields in some areas have been damaged. Industrial growth has slowed compared to recent years owing to fail in demand for textiles and problems in that industry. The textile industry suffers from power shortages, reduced availability of cotton, and lack of competitiveness. The country has failed to change the structure of industrial output and its export. Pakistan's export share in GDP has been stagnant for the last 25 years. For example, textiles, leather, agricultural products, etc., constitute about 80% of the total export, which are low technology and low value added products. This market is now declining, having failed to penetrate foreign markets, given its narrow and mostly agricultural-based export items. The country's textile industries have lost their prominent position of the 1970s and currently hold about 2% of the world market. It seems that the government has failed to take initiative of industrial upgrading, which could have played an important role in creating jobs in expanding export sectors. The argument in support of devaluation is that it would make export cheaper in the international market and ultimately export would increase. The experience of successive devaluation shows that exports have increased in volume, but the increase was small compared to the fall in value of the Pakistani rupee, as most of the country's export seems to be textiles, which faces quotas. An important point of the new liberal reforms is to extend the role of the market and reduce the role of the state in economic affairs, based on the assumption that the market is always right. Getting price right, for example, having prices as close as possible to what a free market would determine. Getting price right as a condition for becoming a successful exporter and for achieving high rates of viable growth is बस कंक्लूजन रहेगा. The military spending has been higher than developmental expenditure for the last nearly 3 decades. Moreover, the military and debt repayment has taken away nearly 60% of the total revenue over the last 10 years. With the increase in external imbalances, the government opted to IMF-led Structural Adjustment Program 1988, taking several measures to reduce budget deficits such as the wage restraints, freezing employment in public sector and limiting discretionary grants to provinces. The budget was reduced from 8.5% of the GDP in 1988 to 6.5% in 1990. However, in 1991, a shortfall in the public revenues resulted in an increase in fiscal deficits to 8.7% of the GDP. The government spending on social services, mainly on education and health, which was already lowest compared to other South Asian countries, declined further as a percentage of GDP from 3.4% in 1988 to 2.8% in 1991. The literacy rate in Pakistan is one of the lowest in South Asia and is worse than in countries which have per capita GNP close to Pakistan's level. The total government spending on health and education, measured as a percentage of GDP, remained constant and even declined slightly. The existence of the large proportion of illiterate people would simply mean a lower probability that the ruling elite could be displaced. Since the late 1980s, the evolution of Pakistan's economy is closely linked with international financial institutions and strategic interests of Western countries, especially the United States. As a result, the economy has moved into dependent development, which appears to be an important reason for the ongoing economic crisis, and an attempt to build self-reliance is sidelined. The structural economic weaknesses are associated with the structure of production, items of exports and skill and education levels of the working people, and the nature of the country's economic integration with the global economy. As Tariq, who is also the scholar, has argued about, throughout the 1990s, the IMF had scolded civilian governments for failing to keep their restructuring promises. The Musharraf regime, by contrast, won admiring praises from 1999 onward for sticking to IMF guidelines despite the hardship imposed on the public by austerity measures, improvement and desperation in the burgeoning city slums and countryside. Still home to 67.5% of the population, was exacerbated further. Some 56 million Pakistanis, nearly 30% of the population, now live below the poverty line. The number has increased by 15 million since Musharraf seized power. बस आखिरी पैराग्राफ. Capitalism has failed to remove poverty and inequality despite its long history of penetration in South Asia, under colonial and neo-colonial regimes, and in spite of being backed by the new technology and increased amounts of credits, clearly illustrated by the experience of Pakistan. It is not simply a question of growth rates. As Pakistan's dependence on foreign loans increased, there was little effort by the government to broaden the industrial base to encourage diversification of its exports. At the same time, with the adoption of new liberal economic reforms, imports rose, largely financed through the foreign borrowings. As a consequence, the balance of payments crisis has deepened, though the growth rates picked up for a short period after 2000. It impaired the country's long-term capacity to mobilize domestic resources for long-term investments and obstructed the achievement of sustainable and equitable development. The existence of high illiteracy rates and the neglect of social sectors have also undermined the overall productivity growth in the country. The failure to break the monopoly of land ownership from the rural elites is the root cause in the continuing atrocities against vulnerable sections of rural inhabitants. Moreover, this proved to be a major constraint against the expansion of rural middle classes. Thus, the existence of the large landowners did represent a hurdle to increasing agricultural output and income of the small farmers and tenants. As agricultural surplus remained with a small proportion of rural elites, this further narrowed the markets towards luxury goods rather than investments in capital goods sectors to improve the overall productivity of the manufacturing sectors and competitiveness. The rural rich are now much more connected with the urban rich through their investment diversification within the family, benefits from urbanization of land and social interaction, and in the current situation, the old rural-urban divide does not have much relevance. In recent years, crony capitalism flourished, while local industries that were once the backbone of the economy were left to decline. Pakistan's export is based on primary commodities with a heavy dependence on cotton and textile industry and neoliberal economic reforms since 1988, and this did not alter the situation. Successive governments have neglected the industrial upgrading necessary for economic development and have thus failed to diversify economic activities and build a successful manufacturing sector.